Hirosato, Hiro Dad, hello, can I have your autograph? Teacher Yuan, don't tease me with such things. Yesterday, my deeds were already on the news, and teachers and students have all seen it. Yuan Tomo shook her head and said seriously, News, I've seen it all. I didn't expect Sato to be so powerful. Did you study Kung Fu before? I smiled. I just exercise frequently and have a good body. Where would I have studied any Kung Fu? My words caused a flash of doubt in Yumi's mind. Does her husband exercise often? Why has she never seen it? On the other side, Jung Tama couldn't help but complain. This can't be explained just by having a good body, right? Tell me, are you a legendary martial arts master? There are no martial arts masters in this world. You have to believe in science. Believe in science, martial arts masters don't exist. Jung Tama blinked. You just flew up with Lightfoot skills. Jung Tama is not old. Just like Yumi, she is one of the youngest teachers and often has a personality that is as lively as a student. I didn't want to discuss this topic too much. After chatting with Yumi in the office for a while, I said goodbye and left. After the exams, the school finally had a break, and Yumi and I took the babies on a plane back to Sichuan. At this moment, the system's voice sounded, Congratulations to the host for completing the first flight with the babies, awarded proficiency in piloting all vehicles, and a private Gulfstream G650 jet. I hadn't had a chance to share this good news with Yumi when the plane suddenly shook violently, scaring all the passengers. My face changed drastically, and I immediately checked the child safety seats the flight attendant had delivered earlier, confirming that the 3 babies were safe. Yumi grabbed my arm tightly, her face pale. Husband, what should we do? Don't worry, it's okay, it's okay. I comforted Yumi and looked up at the flight attendant who had almost fallen earlier. What happened? At this time, 3 siren blasts sounded in the cabin, and the flight attendant quickly said, I'm sorry, sir. Our plane has encountered strong turbulence. Before she could finish speaking, the plane shook violently again. Now even a fool knew it couldn't be turbulence. The plane had crashed. The chief flight attendant, stumbling and holding onto chairs, shouted at all passengers to sit down and fasten their seatbelts while struggling toward the cockpit door. She entered the password, then looked up at the TV on the cockpit door. The TV immediately displayed the scene inside the cockpit. Seeing the scene on the screen, the chief's face changed drastically. Both pilots were slumped over the control panel, unconscious. And worse, a huge hole appeared in the left windshield, and there was a strange-looking bird's carcass in the cockpit. The plane had hit a bird. The chief's heart was filled with despair. The flight route was carefully selected. In theory, there are birds that can fly to this altitude, but it is very rare. I also saw the scene on the TV. I gritted my teeth and suddenly unbuckled my seatbelt and rushed up. You go and watch the babies for me. I staggered to the chief's side and shouted. I can fly a plane, I shouted. At this moment, I couldn't care about anything else. My beloved woman and babies were on the plane. I had to step forward. You can fly a plane? Hearing me say this, a glimmer of hope immediately appeared on the chief's originally despairing face. In an emergency, the chief couldn't care about anything else. She quickly climbed up from the ground, lay on the cockpit door, and entered the opening password. Sir, please, you must succeed. I nodded and reached out to grasp the door handle tightly, so as to avoid the imbalance of air pressure inside and outside after the lock was opened. Relying on all the strength of my body, I pulled the door tight. Hurry up and help me watch the babies. The chief deftly climbed to my seat, fastened her seatbelt, and then joined Yumi to protect the 3 babies. Husband. At this moment, Yumi was already crying into tears, but she didn't know what to say. She knew that her husband was doing something very dangerous, but he had to do it. I shouted to Yumi, Wife, please believe in me. I will come back safely. For you and the babies, I can definitely do it. Watch out, I'm going to open the door. As soon as I said this, the surrounding passengers and flight attendants immediately bent down, held their heads, and tensed their entire bodies. I slammed open the cockpit door, and the instantaneously created air pressure difference caused the entire plane to shake violently again. The howling wind poured into the first-class cabin and then quickly filled the entire cabin. Even the economy class behind became chaotic. The flight attendants screamed, trying their best to calm down the passengers who were crying out in terror. Gritting my teeth, I used all my arm strength to control myself as I squeezed into the cockpit, and then with a bang, the door closed. Only then did the cabin finally calm down. Husband. Yumi was already tearful. holding the babies tightly and praying in her heart. Inside the cockpit, I was stunned by the scene before me. The bird that collided with the airliner at high altitude had smashed through the co-pilot's windshield. I roughly looked at it. The two pilots were slumped over the control panel, unconscious, and I didn't know if they were still breathing. I resisted the wind pressure with all my might. At this moment, I couldn't care about anything else. I slowly unbuckled the captain's seatbelt and quickly sat in the pilot's seat. Then, I placed both hands on the plane's control stick. The system awarded proficiency in piloting all vehicles, let alone a civil airliner. Even if you gave me a space shuttle, I could handle it. At this time, the plane was falling rapidly and it was about to hit the mountain ridge below. I pulled the control stick with both hands. Rise for me! Under my control, the plane finally began to lift its nose. Fortunately, only the co-pilot's windshield was broken, and all engines were normal. At this moment, I also breathed a sigh of relief. Fortunately, the plane was normal. On the other side, in the cabin, after clearly feeling the plane begin to climb, the chief flight attendant wept with joy. That man was telling the truth. He really could fly a plane. Everyone was saved. At the same time, the Ground Aviation Administration in E-Province, which was responsible for the airliner I was on, suddenly saw the air traffic controller Go-Ai's brow furrow. The altitude and route of the plane on the coordinate map were changing violently. He picked up the microphone and quickly connected the contact. China Air 6. China Air 6. This is E-Province Ground Aviation Administration. Please answer if you hear. The radar showed that the altitude of the plane was constantly decreasing, and there was no response. I immediately realized that something was wrong. Director, something is wrong. Director Ma Tae-jun, who was in charge on the scene, heard Go-Ai's voice and immediately turned his head to look. Director, China Air 6 is deviating from its course, and its altitude is dropping rapidly. We cannot reach the crew. Ma Tae-jun's brow immediately furrowed, and he continued to contact. Sure enough, after seeing the abnormal and rapid decline in the plane's altitude, Ma Tae-jun couldn't help but gasp. Something was wrong. On the plane, I was resisting the cold wind, constantly pouring in from the broken windshield while trying my best to control the plane. The temperature at an altitude of 10,000 meters is too low. If it weren't for my physical fitness being far beyond that of a normal person, I would likely have lost consciousness due to the low temperature and strong wind by now. The whistling wind kept echoing in my ears, but amidst this sound, I vaguely heard the call from ground control in my headset. In the plane's current state, it was impossible to fly to Sichuan. It could only make an emergency landing at the nearest provincial capital of E-Province. But the problem was, the plane was originally fully fueled to fly to Sichuan. If it landed in E-Province, it would inevitably carry an excessive amount of fuel, which meant landing overweight. I didn't hesitate to hang up the emergency code 7700. This was to declare to all ground and aircraft that the plane was in an emergency. Almost at the same time, the ground control center immediately noticed this. After discovering that the plane had set the emergency code, Ma Tae-jun's heart, which had been raised, relaxed slightly. The ability to set an emergency code shows that the crew is not incapacitated. Continue calling and have other aircraft in the air also call. After setting the emergency code in the sky, I still faced a huge problem. At 10,000 meters, without aircraft instruments to assist in displaying the route, I had no idea where I had flown to. The original flight plan was to Sichuan. It obviously could no longer be used. To fly to E-Province, the flight plan had to be changed. China Air 6 requests to change flight plan to land at the capital airport of E-Province. Approved. Continue calling. The tense expression on Ma Tae-jun's face did not relax. He knew that this was a critical moment and could not be slackened. Seeing that the route change was approved in the sky, I breathed a sigh of relief. Fortunately, other equipment on the plane was normal, which saved me a lot of effort. Only then did I have the energy to respond to the calls on the radio. Because the wind was too loud and the noise severely interfered with communication, I could only do my best to shout, E-Province, E-Province, China Air 6. Piloting the plane, I alone allowed China Air 6 to just drag itself out of danger. On the plane, the chief flight attendant kept comforting Yumi, "Don't worry, we will be fine." Yumi held the babies tightly and nodded vigorously, tears swirling in her eyes. "I am her and the babies, hero. Since I appeared in Her and the Babies' lives, I have been a harbor that sheltered them from the wind and rain. Now, I have stepped forward like a hero once again. And this time, what I am shouldering is no longer just our small home, but also the more than 100 passengers on the plane. Husband, come on! Yumi trusted me wholeheartedly and prayed silently in her heart. On the ground, it was already in a state of emergency. Security, fire, and hospital departments were ready to provide first aid if the China Air 6 I was piloting encountered an accident. In the sky, I was flying towards Jiangcheng Airport, but I glanced at the fuel gauge and shook my head. The fuel that was originally expected to fly to Sichuan had now consumed less than half. Landing in this situation was undoubtedly an overweight landing, which would bring huge safety hazards to the plane. After checking, I found a headache. It did not have an aerial fuel dumping system. For this reason, I had another method. Since there was not too much fuel, I just needed to circle in the air for a while to burn off the excess fuel. Suddenly, I discovered 2 planes approaching on the radar. Then, a message came through. China Air 6? China Air 6? This is the Central Theater Air Force. We are ordered to escort you. Hearing this news, I understood. With the technology of Air Force fighter jets, it would normally be impossible to appear on the radar of a civil airliner. To appear openly, the other party must have actively turned off the stealth system. At this moment, sure enough, I saw one of the most advanced Chinese fighter jets appear on the left and right sides of the plane. With my eyesight, I could even see the pilot in the cockpit making a thumbs-up gesture to me. At this moment, the 2 Air Force pilots escorting me also finally saw the situation inside the cockpit, and each couldn't help but gasp. Under the conditions of a broken windshield, high altitude, low temperature, low pressure, and low oxygen, I was still able to steadily control the plane. Looking at my condition, it seemed like there was nothing wrong with my body. This brother is really a fierce guy. Even these well-trained Air Force pilots couldn't necessarily do this kind of thing. And I still had the leisure to make gestures to them. The pilot suddenly noticed that the gesture I was making was the internationally recognized pilot communication gesture. I was going to circle to consume fuel. The pilot passed his observations to the ground. Ground, this is Winged Bird. We have approached China Air 6 and are escorting it. Co-pilot windshield broken, 2 pilots in the cabin incapacitated. Pilot preparing to circle to consume fuel to avoid overweight landing. Over. Knowing that I was preparing to circle to avoid an overweight landing, Ma Taejun's heart on the ground rose again. The plane's landing was extremely dangerous. An amateur enthusiast who has not undergone orthodox training and has only simulated flying on a civil flight simulator. Can he do it? Gradually, I finally flew over Jiangcheng. As I circled, the fuel of the plane gradually decreased and finally dropped within the range of a safe landing. Only then did I breathe a sigh of relief. At this time, the outskirts of Jiangcheng Airport were already crowded with aviation enthusiasts who had rushed over. Journalists from major media were already ready, and security, fire, and doctors were watching on standby. The aviation enthusiasts on the outskirts looked at the scene of the broken windshield through telescopes, and their faces instantly turned pale. My God! In this situation, how did this fierce guy fly the plane back? After the 3 alarms sounded, the chief flight attendant immediately made a gesture to a flight attendant at the cabin control position. The latter immediately took down the microphone hanging on the wall next to her and shouted to the passengers in the cabin. Attention all passengers! The plane is about to make an emergency landing. Please bend down and lower your heads. I began to decelerate the plane. I quickly opened the speed brakes on the wings, carefully reducing the plane's speed bit by bit. Under my control, the plane, which was moving rapidly, finally had a trend to decelerate. Everyone stared intently at the plane sliding on the runway. The runway was almost at the end. Once it reached the end without successfully decelerating, the plane would rush off the runway. Many people were praying for China Air 6 in their hearts. Finally, just as the plane was about to rush to the end of the runway, after a brief silence, thunderous cheers erupted throughout the airport. The ambulance quickly drove to the side of the plane, opened the car door, and countless doctors lifted stretchers and jumped out of the car with first aid kits. A reporter who was live streaming had even started reporting. Dear viewers, China Air 6, which has been highly concerned by the whole society, has now successfully made an emergency landing at Jiangcheng International Airport. On the other side in the cabin, Yumi couldn't care about anything else. At the moment the plane stopped completely, she put the babies in her arms on the seat. Then she unbuckled her seatbelt, stood up, and stumbled towards the cockpit. even bumping her forehead because she was too anxious. Yumi frantically beat the cockpit door. "Husband, how are you?" I, in the cockpit, stared blankly at the stopped plane. The sirens of fire trucks and ambulances quickly approached my ears. I was a bit dazed. Although the system allowed me to master piloting skills, I never thought that faced with a plane with a broken windshield, I would actually succeed in landing it safely from 10,000 meters high. "Husband, open the door!"